What's up guys, I'm J-Man. And about 5 years ago, I did a video on the movie Superman 2, namely comparing the 1980 Richard Lester version with the 2006 Richard Donner cut. It was a video that really put my channel on the algorithm and to this day is still my highest viewed video on my channel. I also released a follow-up video to it responding to some interesting comments I got on it, which I recommend you watch if you haven't already. But now that plenty of time has passed, I think it's time to finally ask, do I still feel the same way about my initial thoughts regarding both versions of the film? Now first of all, something I feel like I have to get out of the way. As with most of my videos, there's definitely some stuff in my other video that I wish I either explained better or said differently. Not to mention some other stuff that I wish I did differently. Man, that goatee. I look like a convict. Believe it or not, that was during a time period when I was trying to create a more cocky personality for myself and my channel. But with regarding the question of if I still prefer the Lester version of Superman 2, the answer is yes. I still very much prefer the Lester version of Superman 2, and I still stand by the basic points that I make in my other video, even if I wish I made them a little better. However, and this is a big however, I am actually glad that the Donner cut exists. The last thing I want is to give people the impression that I support what happened with Richard Donner in any way. Never let it be said that I do not support any artist's vision being fully realized and allowed to be seen. In fact, something many may not know about me is that I usually prefer any director's cut or alternative cut to a film that exists, as opposed to the studio release version. This is just one of those very rare times where I actually prefer the theatrical release. But it had nothing to do with the behind-the-scenes drama of the film. It was all strictly from a storytelling standpoint. In fact, something else kind of interesting is that when I first saw the Donner cut, I guarantee you I was ready to love it. Unfortunately, it not only more or less felt like the same movie just with different footage, but some of it just made less sense to me. It still feels very incomplete and, if anything, just comes off as a really elaborate fan edit. In fact, that's kind of almost what it is. Believe it or not, Richard Donner was not the one who started assembling the Donner cut. It was actually started by an editor named Michael Someone tell me how to pronounce that. And Richard Donner was not brought in until much later when they already got it going. But that's not to say that the Donner cut isn't without its own merit. Even some of it, dare I say, better than the Lester version, which I'll get into later. Now regarding the question of if I had preferred if Richard Donner had stayed to make Superman 2, well, not only would I have preferred that, but I also would have preferred if he'd been allowed to create his whole original plan with Superman. According to what I've seen and read, Superman the movie and Superman 2 were supposedly going to be one story, just as a two-part epic. Part 1 would be about Superman's birth, him stopping Lex Luthor, and then part 2 would be about him battling the Zod Squad in Metropolis and ending with Lois's death and Superman turning back time. But not only did he have clashes with the producers Alexandra and Ilya Salkin as well as Pierre Spengler about budget reasons and artistic visions, but the studio itself was unsure if the movies would even be a hit. To which I say, why even release the movie under your logo if you don't even know if it'll make you money, but I digress. In any case, they decided to mostly focus on part 1 and keep the time travel ending just in case it didn't do well. And if it was a hit, then they would keep making Superman 2 and just fix the ending when they got to it. But then came problems with the Salkins and Pierre Spengler removing Marlon Brando from part 2 because they either didn't want to or just couldn't meet his ridiculous demands of wanting a percentage of the box office gross. And Donner himself reportedly threatening that if Spengler was still working on it, he wouldn't be. So he was eventually fired and replaced with Richard Lester. So I guess you could look at it as a severe case of studio politics and personal egos getting in the way of a true artistic vision. Anyway, point being, I wanted to like the Donner cut, and I definitely would have preferred it if they stuck with Donner. As it stands, there are parts of the Donner cut that work better than the Lester version, but as a whole, still feels very incomplete, and if anything, just serves as a small taste of what could have been. Now regarding the stuff that works better than the Lester version, the Donner cut does have a leg up when it comes to continuity with the first film. For instance, it is good to have Marlon Brando's Jor-El back, in fact not just for continuity reasons, but also because Jor-El was still an integral part of Superman's story. He is the God metaphor to Superman's Jesus, the ethereal cosmic guiding light for Superman to become the hero that he is. When Clark gets his powers back, I still have my issues with it, but I can still understand why people gravitate more towards it. It's essentially God restoring his son to life, and a father giving the last of himself to help his son be the best version of himself. The lesser version may pale in comparison, but I always preferred it because it became more of a personal thing for Clark to achieve on his own, which felt more rewarding, rather than something which felt uncomfortably like a contrivance at that point. I mean, Jor-El said that if he gave them up, they would be gone forever and there would be no turning back, so it seems a little convenient that there was a way to restore them after all, even if it meant the end of Jor-El himself. But again, I understand why people like it. It is Jor-El's story coming full circle and helping Superman at his lowest point. Now, one thing that people have praised the Donner cut for is that it removed the unnecessary humor that the Lester version had. Now, I will definitely admit that the Lester version does have a lot of cringy humor and stuff that it just could have done without. I guess the argument is that they were trying to embrace the campiness and silliness that they thought accompanied being a comic book movie at the time, whose demographic was mostly for kids. However, a lot of it just does come off as... not so good. However, I would also argue that the Donner cut actually comes with its own cringy humor, even to the point where it's kind of facepalm inducing.
What was that he said before? He saw a girl?
I thought he said curl.
What's a curl?
Well, isn't that what the old Canaveral guys used to call a comet with an east-west trajectory?
How should I know? I was back in high school in those days. All right. Which one of you guys is using the hairdryer?
General, would you care to step outside?
General, haven't you ever heard of freedom of the press?
Think of it.
The first of the three.
Three.
Is their leader, General Zod.
Count them, 3 supervillains. Each one with the same power he has. They'll need a contact here on Earth. South, Miss Tessmacher!
Think of it. 3 supervillains.
All 3 with the same power he has. They need a contact on Earth. Too true to be good. Right?
On the other hand, even if I do find it cringy and just plain not funny, I can at least respect it. Ultimately, this is the footage that Donner himself chose to use for his cut, and if anything, it could keep with the lighter, campier tone that Donner was going for with the first movie. And I won't deny that there are plenty of people who do find it funny, or at the very least, find it preferable to the Lester humor. So in that sense, I can kind of respect it as an artist's creative freedom. Now there's also the issue with editing in the Donner cut. In the Lester version, it has a more even pace and a sense of coherency with the plot, love story, and ultimate conclusion. Whereas in the Donner version, it feels very choppy and incoherent. Like we're jumping from one sketch to another with no sense of direction. My guess is that there were some scenes in the script that Lester had filmed after Donner left, and when they were assembling the Donner cut, they kept some of those Lester filmed scenes just for the sake of a more complete story. But Donner didn't want any Lester scenes in his cut, so he had them taken out. Now some might resort to thinking that this was just Donner's ego or his general pickiness, but the real reason is because seeing those scenes just hurt him too much.
I've looked at it a couple times, I've given my input as best I can, but I can't do it anymore. I can't divorce myself from the disparagement of time.
I will admit, it does hurt the movie in some ways and makes it feel very underwritten, but I can still understand his reasons for not wanting them at least. Speaking of underwritten, there is also the issue with the test footage scene. Now, I expressed my dislike of this scene in my other video, but I also kind of realized that there is another issue that I have with it, and that is the whole scene just reeks of early draft of the script. Not only because I would argue that Lois herself is acting a bit out of character and playing a cruel trick on Clark, but also because it doesn't make logical sense with the first movie. So, we're to believe that Clark can act fast enough to catch a bullet with his bare hand, but not so much that he can't even see that one didn't even leave the barrel? Plus, wouldn't he need to be able to feel it hit his hand to know he caught it, but somehow can't feel them hit his own body? On the other hand, a lot of people have expressed distaste with the alternative. Clark just randomly trips on a rug and his hand falls right into the open fire. Lois sees that it's perfectly fine, giving Clark no choice but to come out as Superman. However, I would argue that, as silly as it may seem, it does help with the love story better, which further influences Clark's decision to lose his powers and become human. The Donner version has very little in terms of romance. If anything, it just tells us that they're in love, but I never really bought it. Sure, they have dinner together later, but the emotion is just not there. It still feels very underwritten. However, to people's credit, I have heard people say that this scene does demonstrate Lois's craftiness and ability to get the truth out no matter what it takes. I personally don't enjoy it, but at the same time I can understand how others do. So in closing, I feel like it all comes down to this. The Donner version is the overall better sequel, whereas the Lester version is the overall better movie, if that makes sense. Sure, it is a little too silly for its own good at times, and the tone feels very inconsistent with the tone of the first movie established by Donner. But as a movie on its own, it weirdly feels like an overall better experience. But that's not to say that I don't enjoy the Donner version at all. I do still occasionally come back to it, if anything, just to revisit what might have been and still wish could have been. I just personally prefer the Lester version, and I'm really glad that people like the Donner version as much as they do. And if you can, try to support these other versions of other movies that deserve to see the light of day. Every artist needs to express their distinct vision. So be sure to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and please support me on Patreon. All links are down below in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the J-Man. Keep looking deep.